Alright, hello, good day everyone. Welcome to another lecture that we will have today in positive psychology. And our lecture for today is a very usual topic among students who are just new in understanding the field. We will talk about the short history of positive psychology. Ganyan naman lagi, di ba? Yung isa sa mga unang topics for every term, for every semester is the history of the subject that we are talking about. So as the word implies in the slide, meron ditong salitang short. This lecture is by no means a comprehensive lecture about positive psychology. Because of time constraints, hindi natin kayang pag-usapan lahat ng nangyari leading to positive psychology. If you want to know the nitty-gritty and all the details on the history of positive psychology, I suggest you can just find any textbook in positive psychology. Usually, there is an entire chapter that talks about the history of positive psychology. But we will not do that here. In fact, these things that I'm going to share with you today comes from a very short journal article written by Jeffrey Froh that summarizes how positive psychology emerged. I'm going to upload a copy of this, but again, yung approach dito ni Jeffrey Froh, very summative. It's not that comprehensive, but the things he shared in this article, in this reading, is very important in the history of positive psychology. All right? So let's start discussing the short history of the field. During the times of the psychoanalytic movement and behaviorism, remember these were the first two waves, the first two forces in psychology in understanding the human mind. If you still remember your theories of personality, magkaiba sila ng approach in understanding the mind. Anong sabi ng mga psychoanalyst? The psychoanalytic movement believes that the human mind must be understood by internal forces. Id, ego, superego, the unconscious, defense mechanisms, things like that. While behaviorism, they say, if you want to understand the mind, the psyche, you need to focus on the environment that shaped it. Diba? Kaya, sino yung mga big names in psychoanalytic movement? We have Freud, Adler, Carl Jung, and others. On the other hand, behaviorism, nandyan sila B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, sila B.F. Skinner, Pavlov, John Watson, so on and so forth. Very contrasting views about the human mind. But, believe it or not, although they disagree with a lot of things, meron naman silang common agreement. And what is that? They believe that their respective movements must be focusing on how to treat mental illness. Yan talaga yung favorite topics nila. How do you deal or how do you treat a mental illness using psychoanalytic concepts? That's what you do in psychotherapy. Versus how do you deal with mental illness using behaviorism principles? Yan naman yung goal ng behavior modification. Counterpart yan eh. These two subfields aim a common thing, and that is how to treat a mental illness well. Psychotherapy versus behavior modification. Now, during these times, usong-uso yan. So, basically, psychology is all about mental illness and how to treat mental illness. There were a number of psychologists who got drained. Sa Tagalog, nagsawa na talking about mental illness. They got tired of viewing or they got tired of having the disease model of the mind. Nagsawa na sila. They want a breath of fresh air. They want a change of scenery. Bakit ba lagi na lang nakaka-depress yung mga pinag-uusapan natin in psychology? And so these psychologists who wanted a different approach in dealing with the human mind, they went looking to other fields of knowledge that may inspire them to study the positive side of human beings. And guess where they found this? Na-inspire sila ng existentialism and phenomenology. I will no longer lecture on what existentialism and phenomenology is, but these are philosophical approaches. Ginagawa ito in the field of philosophy. So these psychologists put their attention on how philosophers talk about things in their field. Na-attract ngayon yung mga psychologists. You know why? Because in philosophy, in using existentialism and phenomenology, they found out that philosophers are free to talk about the topics that these psychologists want to talk about, which is again the positive side of the human mind. Nakita nila yung mga philosophers, they were discussing things about justice, courage, and guess what? Happiness. Again, using existentialism and phenomenological approaches. So these psychologists were so inspired that they told themselves, pwede naman palang pag-aralan yung positive side of the person. Maybe we can adopt this approach that philosophers use. Why not let's talk about these things in our own field? Justice, courage, and of course, happiness. Not only that, these psychologists also went back in history and they saw that one of the founding fathers of psychology by the name of William James, very important name, you're a psych major, you need to know William James. Sabi nila si William James, founder ng psychology ito, he also focused on positive psychology. So one of the original topics that psychology talks about, it's not mental illness. It's something to do with positive psychology. Now, in the case of William James, one of his expertise as a psychologist, he likes studying religious experiences, which you can place under one of the topics in positive psychology. Kasi yung religious experiences, ginagamit yan to understand how people view the world, how people cope with stress. As we know, there are many studies that religion is a very good psychological resource to help people achieve mental health, to help people cope better with stress. Oh, si William James nga founder na ng psychology yan. Yan yung interest niya. In fact, he wrote an entire book about religious experiences, the varieties of religious experiences, which I highly recommend you read. Ako, I've read this so many times na. Ang dami niyang sinishare dito na interesting ideas about the nature of religious experiences, which I think up until today is very relevant. Anyway, let me read to you one excerpt from this book by William James. Sabi ni William James, we must judge the tree by its fruit. The best fruits of religious experience are the best things history has to offer. The highest flights of charity, devotion, trust, patience, and bravery to which the wings of human nature have spread themselves have all been flown for religious ideals. Now, take note of those words. One of the things that William James repeatedly touches in his book are the following concepts: charity, devotion, trust, patience, bravery. In the context of religious experiences, these are positive psychology topics. Diba? So kung marirealize ninyo, William James is, again, a positive psychologist. He likes to talk about positive psychology things. In fact, there was this one researcher, at the same time a historian, who documented what William James said in his presidential address when he assumed the presidency of APA noong 1906. Ganun kasi sa APA, pag nagiging presidente ka, meron kang presidential address where you are going to talk to the entire community of psychology professionals. In this inaugural speech, talagang mapapansin mo yung inclination ni William James to talk about the positive side of the human mind. Let me read for you that excerpt from that researcher. So, sabi ni Rotund, in his presidential address, his here, yung his dito, si William James yan, no? In James's presidential address to the American Psychological Association in 1906, William James asked why some individuals were able to utilize their resources to their fullest capacity and others were not. Again, that's a very positive psychological question. In order to understand this, he said, again, William James said, two more questions must be answered. And those are, letter A, what are the limits of human energy? And letter B, how could this energy be stimulated or enhanced or increased and released so it could be put to optimal use? Ano na naman napansin nyo? Those questions are very positive psychological. How do you increase a person's strength? How do you increase a person's potential? Hindi siya nag-mention dito ng mental illness. Hindi siya nag-mention dito ng disease model of the mind. That's why if there's one thing that you need to realize at this point of this lecture, the call and curiosity for positive psychology already existed for so long. Sa Tagalog, matagal na palang nangyayari yan. Seligman et al. Are not the only ones doing this. Now, the article, the writer of the article emphasized on this because most students of positive psychology think that it was Martin Seligman and his associates were the ones who started positive psychology. Mali pala yun. We should not exclusively attribute positive psychology to Martin Seligman and his associates. Hindi sila yung nagpasimula. They just continued the call to focus more on the positive side of the human mind. Pero hindi sila yung nagsimula. As far back as William James, there is already a call for psychologists to focus on the positive side of the human mind. In fact, I would even say, and some authors would believe that William James, hindi nga rin siya yung nagpasimula ng positive psychology eh. You can go as far back as to Aristotle. Wala pa talagang formal psychology niyan. But Aristotle had a lot of ideas that can be considered as precursors or foundations to positive psychology. May sinabi si Aristotle about happiness. Happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Isa yan sa mga major teachings ng positive psychology. Not to mention, Aristotle also said a lot of things about pleasure, which is again another topic in the field of positive psychology. Alright, so hindi sila Martin Seligman yung una na nag-raise ng call for psychologists to focus more on the positive side of human beings. Marami. As far back as Aristotle, ginagawa na yan. But anyway, among all these figures that really promoted positive psychology, ang pinakasumikat talaga, ang pinakamalakas ang impact, we would say, is Abraham Maslow. That's another name to remember, Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow is very associated with the term humanistic psychology, also known as the human potential movement, or also known as the third force in psychology. Remember, what's the first force? The psychoanalytic movement. We are looking at the person's internal drives, the unconscious, to understand the mind. Ano yung second movement? Behaviorism, the complete opposite of the psychoanalytic movement. In behaviorism, the human mind is 100% shaped by the environment, rewards, and punishments. Dito na yung third force. Kaya siya tinawag na third force, humanistic psychology. Also known as human potential movement, wherein, again, if we are going to reference this to Abraham Maslow, the main goal of this movement is to teach people how to self-actualize, how to have a more fulfilled life. Again, these ideas are the foundations of positive psychology. Abraham Maslow pa lang. Si Abraham Maslow mismo, concerned na about positive psychology. And of course, you would agree that Abraham Maslow is way, way before than Martin Seligman, right? Kaya, again, another thing I want you to realize here, Abraham Maslow is a positive psychologist, just like William James. Mas sumikat lang sa Abraham Maslow. Oh. In fact, just to prove that Abraham Maslow is indeed a positive psychologist, he wrote a book entitled Motivation and Personality. Doon pa lang yung word na motivation, hindi naman pinag-aaralan masyado yan sa disease model of the mind. Because motivation is not a psychological illness. You don't need treatment for motivation. In fact, maganda nga yun pag mataas yung motivation mo. But Abraham Maslow focused a lot of his writings on the psychology of motivation. But anyway, going back to this book, noong 1954, it was published, there was a chapter in this book that happened to be the last chapter, Abraham Maslow entitled the last chapter, Toward a Positive Psychology. In that chapter, pinipredict na ni Maslow or pinupush na ni Maslow yung mga psychologists that it's about time to move on to balance the field and talk about the positive side of the human mind. Yan yung point nung chapter na yan. Kaya nga siya last chapter And trivia, and hold on to your seats. Did you know that when Maslow, that those words, towards a positive psychology, those two words, positive psychology, this is the first time that that term was used in the field. Yan yung first time na kinoin yung term na positive psychology. William James, hindi pa, wala pang term na positive psychology. It was Abraham Maslow who coined that term, positive psychology, in this chapter of his book. Let me read to you an excerpt from that chapter para makita nyo kung ano sinasabi ni Maslow dito. The science of psychology has been for more successful on the negative than on the positive side. It has revealed to us much about man's shortcomings, his illnesses, his sins, but little about potentialities, his virtues, his achievable aspirations, or his full psychological height. Take note, no? Dinidescribe dito ni Maslow yung imbalance in the field. Too much negative, very few on the positives. It is as if psychology had voluntarily restricted itself to only half of its rightful jurisdiction, and that the darker, meaner half. So yun yung call ni Abraham Maslow. Balansehin natin yung field. It's about time to talk about virtues, achievable aspirations, full psychological height. In his term later on, it becomes self-actualization. So again, balik na naman tayo sa slide na to. I want you to realize something. The call and curiosity for positive psychology already existed for so long. Pwede na ngayon nating dagdagan ng figure. Before Seligman, there was Aristotle. Before Seligman, there was William James. Before Seligman, there was Abraham Maslow. O, di ba? So hindi talaga sila Seligman ang nagpauso or ang nag-imbento ng positive psychology. That's the point of the article, no? Sino nga ba yun? Nalimutan ko, by Jeffrey Froh. Kaya nga niya sinulat yan He wants his readers to realize that Seligman's call for paradigm shift did not just start in the late 90s and early 2000s. Kasi remember, dyan naging presidente si Martin Seligman, 1998, and then he made the call to quote-unquote start positive psychology. So naging booming yung research in positive psychology during that period, 90s, late 90s, and early 2000s. Ang sinasabi ng author of the article, Aristotle, William James, Abraham Maslow are so underappreciated in their role to promote positive psychology. Now, the question is, why does Seligman not acknowledge the third force so much? That's a very good question to ask. Kasi kung papakinggan mo yung mga speeches ni Seligman, if you take a look at his writings in positive psychology, he rarely mentions humanistic psychology. He rarely mentions, or maybe not at all, Abraham Maslow. What could be the reason? There could be research methodological issues. Kasi si Martin Seligman, in doing his research, he would prefer the positivistic approach over the phenomenological approach. You've heard phenomenology a while ago, right? This is an approach usually being done by philosophers when they talk about certain things in their field. So, i-emphasize natin yung positivism. Martin Seligman is a positivist. Ano ba ibig sabihin ng positivism? This is one way to understand the human mind wherein everything must be measurable. Let me read. Based on APA's definition of positivism, a family of philosophical positions holding that all meaningful propositions must be, ayan na, reducible to sensory experience and observation. And so, that all genuine knowledge is to be built on strict adherence to empirical methods of verification. In other words, if you want to study the human mind, you need to be exact. You need to get the numbers. You need to measure certain things. Measure stress, measure love, measure depression. Kaya kapag sinabi mong isa kang psychologist na positivistic, naniniwala ka na yung human mind can only be understood through numbers. Kaya mahilig ka magbigay ng psychological test. Kaya gusto mo lahat mini-measure. I won't believe a psychological claim if I don't see the numbers, if I don't see the statistics, if I don't see these tables. Diba? Ayaw na ayaw niya yan, no? Ayaw na ayaw niya ng statistics. Believe it or not, kaya tayo may psychological statistics because many psychologists prefer the positivistic method of understanding the mind. That includes Seligman. That includes behaviorism. Kaya tayo nagkaroon ng SAISTA ng psychological statistics because of behaviorism. Gusto kasi ng behaviorism lahat sinusukat. Just like how it's done in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, geology, di ba maraming math doon eh. So sabi ng mga behaviorists, if we want psychology to be acknowledged as one of the natural sciences, we need to be doing the things that they are doing. We need to be positivistic about things. We should measure everything. Kahit na pinag-aaralan natin mga psychological variables, let's come up with a way how to measure this, how to measure love, how to measure depression, how to measure deprivation. Ayan. Kaya pag nakakita kayo ng mga journal articles that show you these figures, it is using a positivistic approach in understanding the mind. So these are some of the tables related to happiness. Hindi ko na masyadong i-discuss yan, no? Pero itong table na to, it's showing how happiness differ among males and females. So what do? You measure happiness between males and females and then you compare kung meron bang significant difference, di ba? Kaya ka magtititest. There are also studies in positive psychology where they want to map out happiness in a certain place. Like for instance, in this table, maraming gumagawa ng ganitong study, no? Yung pipili sila ng isang locality, halimbawa, Metro Manila, and then they would like to know the differences of level of happiness among different cities in Metro Manila. Pero ito, hindi to Metro Manila. Sinasabi ko lang yung approach. So, titignan nila, sinong pinakamasaya among different cities in Metro Manila? Manila ba? Pasig? QC? Oh, yun. And then they're going to compare and then they're going to dig deeper. What are the different factors in those cities that determines how happy they are? Hahanapin na ngayon nila yung mga different factors. Ito na yun. Yan. Ito yung mga different factors. Ito yung level of happiness. Gagamit na sila ngayon ng Structural Equational Modeling or SEM for short. Again, that's another approach. Statistical method yon in understanding the mind in the positivistic approach. Other than SEM, meron din tayong linear regression. I hope you remember that from your statistics class. Meron din tayong multiple regression. Oh, di ba? Pero ako in connection to positivism, ito yung favorite na study ko that used the positivistic approach where they studied the relationship between happiness and money. Totoo ba na mas marami kang pera, mas sumasaya ka? O ano sagot doon? And this is well-founded by thousands of research all over the world. Happiness is related to money only to a certain extent. So is happiness related to money? Answer, yes. Only to a certain extent. So in this part of the graph, if you can see, the more income you receive, the more money you have. Habang dumadami yung pera mo, tumataas din yung level of happiness mo. But what did they find out? Only to a certain extent, because there will be a certain amount of money na kapag meron ka na, ganun na yung level ng money mo, any addition to the money you are currently getting, instead of increasing your happiness, it brings it down. Kapag na-achieve mo na yung point na yon. As we go along this subject, pag-uusapan natin, how much is that amount of money that's just enough for you. Pero focus tayo dito, yun yung point ng study. Money is related to happiness, but only to a certain extent. Kapag sobrang yaman mo na, you are filthy rich. Guess what happens? Ayun, pag yung income mo, talagang filthy rich ka na, sobrang yaman mo na, for some reason, unexpectedly, happiness drops. Akala natin, pag sobrang yaman natin, sobrang saya rin natin. Hindi. Studies show, it actually drops. Happiness drops if you become filthy rich. And that is also very well documented, na maraming mga taong sobrang yaman, ang daming mga mental health issues. Kaya ang lesson dito, hindi rin naman maganda na masyado kang mayaman. Just enough is the ideal amount of money you need to have for you to be happy in life. Ayun. So again, huwag niyong kakalimutan yung point. Kaya si Seligman, hindi niya masyadong minimension sila Maslow and the humanistic psychology kasi nga, yan yung gusto niyang mga research. Yun nga yung problema, actually hindi naman problem, pero that's the thing for the third force. In the third force or humanistic psychology, it's done phenomenologically. Some psychologists adopted the philosophical approach in understanding things, such as psychological things. So ano naman yung phenomenology? Ito yung ayaw ni Seligman, pero gustong-gusto ng humanistic movement. An approach to human knowledge in which both the traditional concerns of philosophy and the modern concern with scientific causation would be set aside in favor of what? A careful attention to the nature of immediate conscious experience. The key word to remember in phenomenology is what? Experience. Yan yung source ng mga psychological conclusions in using phenomenology. Ano ang na-experience mo? If a person experienced this, then it's the truth. Sa positivistic, hindi experience. The data, the numbers, what does the data say? Anong sinasabi ng structural equational modeling? Anong sinasabi ng analysis of variance? That's the truth. Pag positivistic. Pag phenomenological, hindi. Anong sinasabi ng taong naranasan niya? That's the truth. Regardless of the numbers. You see the difference. Kaya sa phenomenology, if you want to study happiness using this approach, you come up with these studies. Paano nakakatulong yung painting sa pagpapasaya ng mga taong may cancer? That's a very good question. Among people who are undergoing a lot, especially when it comes to their health, meron silang cancer. How does that happen? How does art positively contribute to people suffering with that disease? Maganda pag-aralan yan. If you want, you can read this article para malaman ninyo. Another study. na phenomenological lang approach. Ayan, no? Meanings of happiness among two ethnic groups living with advanced cancer in South London. Cancer study rin ito. Pero ito, it's more on how people with cancer define happiness. Because definitely the way a healthy person would define happiness is different from the way people with terminal illness define happiness. Paano maging masaya kapag may sakit kang malubha? Pag alam mong malapit ka nang mawala or maliit yung tsansa mo na gumaling ka pa sa sakit mo, hindi mo alam kailan ka mamamatay, how do you define happiness? How do you keep yourself happy? O, di ba? Phenomenological yun. Hindi mo pwedeng gamitan ng analysis of variance yan. You see? Very different from the positivistic approach. So again, you connect this to Seligman. Medyo ayaw niya ng mga ganyang studies because he is a very positivistic guy. He wants the numbers. He wants the questionnaires. He wants the statistics. Oh, okay? Kaya, itong difference ng positivistic and phenomenology will explain why in psychology we have two ways to do research, di ba? Meron tayong quantitative research, meron din tayong qualitative research. Pero, ito yung sasabihin ko, no? The implication of this in positive psychology research is, dadagdagan natin, it's not only qualitative approach, it's not only quantitative approach, but meron din tayong mixed research methods. So there are basically three ways on how to study happiness in the field of positive psychology, quanti, quali, or mixed. I teach this in psychological research, no? Huwag niyong kino-consider na mortal enemies yung quantitative approach and qualitative approach. No, they're not. Hindi kayo magbobotohan. Sino dito ang quantitative? Taas ang kamay. Sino ang qualitative? Taas ang kamay. No. Quantitative research and qualitative research in psychology, they complement each other. Quantitative research cannot answer all the questions. Same thing as qualitative research, but if you combine the two, quanti and quali, now your understanding about happiness becomes more comprehensive. And it makes a lot of sense, don't you agree? Kapag yung tanong mo kasi, gaano kasaya ang mga lasalista? How happy are they? That's quantitative. So, you give them a psychological test that measures happiness or subjective well-being, compute the scores, and that's it. Now I know how happy Lasalians are. They are very happy. But if I ask you a different question, what makes Lasalians happy? Diba? So, data shows they're very happy, but why? See, quantitative research cannot answer the question, why? It can only answer the question, how much? Pero mahalaga rin yung question na why. Para mas lumalim. Alam natin kung gaano sila kasaya at alam din natin kung bakit sila ganun kasaya. But for you to answer the question why, you need qualitative research. Mag-i-interview ka talaga dyan. By the way, that's the main method na ginagamit for phenomenological approach. So itong mga studies na pinakita ko kanina, ginawa yan through interviews. May mga methods dyan, on how to do interviews using phenomenology. So anyway, going back. Kaya ang trend ngayon sa positive psychology, iniiwasan natin yung masyado tayong exclusive. I only do quanti research. I only do quali research. A lot of positive psychologists today are really gearing towards the mixed approach. Meron tayong quantitative question, then meron tayong qualitative question that will further deepen our understanding about happiness. Let me discuss to you, or let me just read to you the closing paragraph of this article. Remember, ito yung main article natin in this lecture. So ano yung pinaka-ending that contains the message of the author of this article? Let me read to you the excerpt, Ready? Positive psychology will not self-actualize itself until it embraces its history and is more accepting of phenomenology. So sabi niya dapat i-mix. Merong quanti, merong quali. As Rotund writes, adopting an experiential perspective may help build a more unified psychology of optimal human functioning and avoid misunderstandings concerning the role of scientific research in humanistic and positive psychology. Let me continue. Moreover, using phenomenological existential methodology, again, when you interview people, when you ask them about their experience, is essential to explore the questions about what makes life fulfilling or meaningful, which again, the quantitative research, the positivistic approach cannot answer. Diba? The question of what makes, qualitative question yan eh. And then, if humanistic and positive psychology can only join together, ayun, ibig sabihin, mixed method, no? Perhaps, psychology will witness the rise of a powerful and important fourth force. Yun yung wini-wish ng author na sana mangyari, na magkaroon tayo ng fourth force. And what is the fourth force? When we combine the positivistic with the phenomenological. Ang good news naman, I think it's slowly happening today. It's not strong enough yet to be called the fourth force, but it's happening. Many researchers today in psychology, not only in positive psychology, mix na talaga yung approach. We are not only contented seeing the numbers, but we also want to know why the numbers are like that. O, diba? So, yun yung mga different events in the history of psychology in general that led to the current state of positive psychology. Now, before we end this lecture, I just want to give you a little bit of an epilogue, mga closing comments ko about the short history of positive psychology. Let's go back to this slide. 'Di ba sinabi natin na ang positive psychology matagal na pala yan. Aristotle pa lang gusto ng pag-aralan ng tao yan. There is another source that is being ignored by many psychologists today, which I think is a loss. Sayang naman kung i-ignore natin to. That's what the Bible can contribute. Pwede nating idagdag dito sa listahan yung Bible. Because if you read the entire Bible, again, and if you understand what you're reading, you will sense there are a lot of teachings in the scriptures that talks about the positive side of the human mind. I think I mentioned that in the last lecture we had, di ba? As in lahat ng topic natin na nakalagay sa syllabus, may sinasabi yung Bible tungkol sa mga yon. Unfortunately, many people today, because they hate the Bible, they don't read the Bible, they don't consider the Bible as one of the potential sources of positive psychological knowledge. Let me give you one example. One part in the Bible that teaches about happiness, the Beatitudes by Jesus. Ito yung eksena where he is delivering his Sermon of the Mount. Actually, yung sermon, pareho lang naman sa lecture yun eh. Iba lang ng context. Diba? Pag yung lecture mo is about spiritual things, nagiging sermon. Diba? But anyway, in the Beatitudes, if you read Matthew 5, 3-12, you will read Beatitudes. Ano yung word na laging sinasabi ni Jesus dito? The word blessed. Blessed is the man who blank, 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 blank. Yun yung Beatitudes. Now, hold on to your seats. If you study the original word used for the word blessed in the Bible, specifically in Matthew, in its Greek language, even in Aramaic, because Jesus also spoke Aramaic when he was teaching this. Ang original term ng blessed pala is state of happiness. Yes, so in the Bible, whenever you hear the word blessed, blessed is he, blessed is the man, it's the same thing as saying as happy is the man. So don't you realize something here? Very interesting. Jesus is giving a lecture on happiness in the Beatitudes. He was teaching people the different traits that we need to have for us to be happier. In fact, kayo na lang bahala magbasa niya, no? Pero ito yung short list. What are the different traits that Jesus taught people that they should have to have a happy life? Ayan. Nakalagay sa Beatitudes yan. Poor in spirit, those who mourn, meek or humble, hunger for thirst and righteousness, those who are merciful, those who are pure in heart, those who are peacemakers, those who are persecuted in righteousness. If you have these things in your life, the Bible guarantees you will be happier. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, si Jesus ba, paano niya nalaman yan? Nagpa-survey siya? No. Hindi naman kasi siya positivistic eh. During those times, hindi pa masyadong sikat yung positivism. People are very spiritual. Yung positivism kasi related yan sa materialism eh. But anyway, that's another topic, no? But Jesus knew this not because of statistics, but because this is divine revelation. Pero ako, for me as a psychologist, divine revelation can be considered as data rin eh. To understand psychological things, including happiness. Again, you may disagree with me. I'm not forcing this to you, but that's my viewpoint of human psychology. Legitimate data ang divine revelation to teach us about psychological things. And if there is one resource that we have that gives us a lot of spiritual/divine data about happiness, it's the Bible. In fact, para mas consistent gawin nating tao yung Bible, sa tingin ko dapat si Jesus na sa listahan. Even Jesus is a positive psychologist. He talked about what can make the human psyche better. Ibang-iba lang talaga sa teachings ng traditional psychology. Kasi pag traditional psychology talaga, walang kinalaman ng God dyan eh. Walang kinalaman yung mga divine things. But Jesus is different. We'll talk about that in another topic, no? But yeah, hindi lang si Seligman yung nagpauso niyan. Our curiosity, our desire to study the positive side of the mind, matagal nang meron tayo niyan. Alright? It's just that some people are underappreciated for this. Okay, so I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, ilagay nyo lang dyan sa baba. Until the next lecture, Sir Howard here. God bless everyone. Bye-bye.